So this video is going to be in two sections. The first part I'm going to be talking about boundaries in general. And then the second part I'm going to be talking specifically about boundaries in co-counseling. And this video is also going to serve as lesson 16 for the co-counseling lessons. If you don't participate in co-counseling, you probably won't be interested in the latter part of the video. So the fundamental concept of a boundary, which is familiar to some people and not familiar to others, depending on what you learned growing up or earlier in your adult life, is the limits that you set on how close people are allowed to be to you, physically or emotionally, and other limits that you set about how you're willing to be treated, how you're willing to have people interact with you, and how you're willing to have people interact with spaces and objects that belong to you. So the fundamental notion about boundaries, which every child should learn growing up, is that you have the complete right to decide at all times how much anyone is in your space, physically or emotionally, and that no one has the right to say, well, I just get to do this. I just get to touch you even though you don't want to be touched, or I just get to invade your space in some emotional ways that where you don't want to be invaded because of whatever reason, because we're in a relationship, or because I'm your parent, or because you owe me this sort of license to be in your space, or for whatever other reason someone might come up with. It's never acceptable. You don't owe anyone pieces of yourself. The fact that you've been connected to someone, perhaps in intimate ways in the past, doesn't mean you owe them intimacy now, physically or emotionally. And we really need to be wary of people who make excuses for why they're trampling our boundaries, and we need to be wary of people who just act like they're kind of entitled to go where they choose to go. And I'll come back to say more points about that. So the first issue is that you have the absolute right to decide about physical contact, who touches you, who is super close to you physically, obviously who touches you or talks to you in any kind of sexual way. But even in non-sexual ways, you have the complete right to decide what kind of contact you have. And so this is a fundamental right. There are times when a parent or a caretaking adult has to touch a child in certain ways that the child may not want at that moment in order to keep them clean, or in order to do medical care, or in order to remove them from circumstances. But even then, the caretaking adult has a responsibility to say, here's what I'm doing, here's why I'm doing it. It's something that I will only do when it's absolutely necessary, and I am going to do my absolute best to respect the things that you don't like and avoid those when they're not necessary. That's a different message from saying, no, I'm an adult, so I get to touch you in any way that I choose, which is the beginnings of abuse. You have a similar right to control how anyone enters emotional realms. And what I mean by that is that no one gets to demand that you tell them certain things about yourself that you don't want to talk about. No one has the right to demand that you share or expose feelings. Again, even if they've been really open with you, that does not obligate you to be open with them. No one has the right to tell you also what you think or feel. And that's a different kind of invasion that's sometimes not recognized as a boundary invasion, and it is. If someone starts saying, oh, I know that you don't like this, or I know that you do like this, when you're denying that, when you're insisting you feel something else, or when someone starts telling you what your opinions are. Oh, no, you don't think that. No, you don't think that way. Or no, you don't like that. I know you're saying you like such and such a kind of food, or you're saying you like such and such a kind of music. I know you don't really like those things. That's boundary crossing. That's someone essentially crossing into your mind is what it is. They're invading your mental space and your emotional space in a way that they have no right to do. And those emotional invasions are sometimes harder to put our finger on. That's another realm in which we're going to be told that we're too sensitive for not liking it. I'll say more about that in a few minutes. But that's wrong. Your emotional space, your mental space belongs to you, just like your physical space does, and your body space, right? But this is also true about like your space, like your room, or people who don't belong in your home, or people who don't belong in your room within that home, or people who are in your stuff or in your journal, anything like that. People will make excuses for, and there's no excuse. There's no excuse. Those realms are just like your body and your mind. Those realms of physical space that you live in and things that you belong that belong to you in the world. Again, no one's got any right to be messing with those, and there's no excuse for it. Children who grow up with their boundaries being respected learn about boundaries. In fact, adults, to some extent, don't even have to say it explicitly to kids. If they are consistently respecting kids' boundaries and insisting that kids respect each other's boundaries, then it just becomes an understanding about the world that you absorb even if you don't have the language for it. It is very helpful, particularly in our times, for adult caretakers to be explicit with children about what a boundary is and why they have the right to assert it and steps that they should take if those boundaries are violated. About going to a safe adult if those boundaries are violated. Now, huge numbers of us grow up as children with our boundaries just being violated right and left, physically, sexually, emotionally, and for folks with those kinds of histories, the whole notion of a boundary tends to be really muddy and unclear. And so if you're a person who's in that category, who feels like, well, I don't really know what a boundary is, or who feels like, well, I don't know where my boundaries are. Like I don't even know really what I want and don't want anymore. I sometimes, when someone's touching me, I have trouble even figuring out whether I like it or don't like it. Those are all completely predictable, understandable responses of having grown up with the experience of having your boundaries violated a lot. And it can get considerably worse if you then also have adult experiences of repeated violations of your boundaries. So one of the ways that it can affect your life if you've had this kind of history of having your boundaries trampled or being told you don't even have any right to have boundaries or to assert them, is that you can start to just feel generally unsafe in the world and start to feel like, oh, I don't want anybody too close to me. I feel like everyone's trying to pull something on me. I feel like everybody wants something from me. It may make you start to really not like to be touched physically at all, like you're not wanting much affection. It may make sex feel very unsafe or undesirable, or it may be where you can only enjoy sex if it's played out in some very, very specific and rigid ways. Again, entirely understandable effects if you've grown up having your boundaries violated. And folks who grow up with a lot of violations also tend to grow up being given messages that those violations were your own fault, or that there is no violation happening, so like having reality denied, or being told that these are just normal things that shouldn't bother you. There's something wrong with you. So then you're getting a double injury, right? You're getting the injury of having the violation, and then you're getting the injury of being put down, of being told there's something bad about you for not liking this. And so those wounds can compound. Now, these wounds can heal, but they can really take some work and some time to heal. And so the first step is becoming self-forgiving and understanding, and being able to see, oh, well, this is what's going on with me, and this is why I'm not really trusting anybody, and this is why I don't feel safe in the world, or particularly don't feel safe in human society. I should mention that that another result that goes on for a lot of people from past boundary violations is kind of almost like giving up having boundaries. And so then in the present world, rather than kind of closing yourself off from everybody, you may be the style that just where people are just kind of trampling you constantly, emotionally, physically, maybe sexually as well. And you're just feeling like you're not liking it, of course, but you're feeling like, well, that's just life, or that's the way it is, or that's the best I deserve. And so that's another common outcome of a history of repeated boundary violations in the past. Again, it can heal. The message for the short term is just notice what's happening, work towards not blaming yourself for these things, work towards starting to connect it to what your experiences were of having your boundaries violated in the past. That's not going to magically heal these problems, but that's going to be an important start down the healing path, and will at least help you in the short term figure out how you can make at least somewhat better decisions now about what you want and what you don't want, and above all, help you stop blaming yourself for the dynamics that are playing out. The way I think of boundaries is I think of us all as kind of having like a nice, attractive fence around us. Like think of like the nicer looking kind of wooden or picket fence, something that's it's a nice thing. It's not a bad thing to have. It's not bad, and it has a gate in it. And the gate is our control over our boundaries. So the gate allows us to let people in close that we would like to have close, and allows us to keep people out that we don't want close to us. And when we've experienced quite a history of violations, we tend to start to lose control of that gate. And it means that we start to let people in that we really don't want in. And it also means that we start to keep people out that we actually realize eventually we would rather have allowed in. And so we're having closeness that we really don't like with certain people, emotionally or physically, but then we're also losing closeness with some people that maybe probably were trustworthy, or where we would have liked having that closeness with them. And so one way to think about the process of healing from a history of violations and the process of learning to recognize what boundaries we need, establish them, and enforce them in our present lives is to think of like, okay, I'm getting control back over that gate, and I'm going to be able to understand better over time as I heal and as I practice asserting my boundaries, because it's both things. It's the healing and it's the practice asserting boundaries. Over time, I'm going to get better and better control over that gate. And I'm not going to be shutting people out where I really would have loved the connection with them. And I'm not going to be letting people in that I would have much rather not have had any kind of closeness to. And it's really not good for us to allow intimacy emotionally, physically, sexually with people that we don't want it with people that we don't trust, or with people that just wasn't what we wanted. And of course, it's extra unhealthy to do it with people who are invasive, people who are kind of boundary violators by nature. So it is really important to work on reestablishing the control over that gate. And there are real losses in keeping people out that we would like to have let in. I mean, that's not good for us either. Next, I want to talk a little bit about the process of working to assert your boundaries and some of the ways that we get retaliated against when we assert boundaries. And I think to the great majority of people watching this video are going to have encountered some of the kinds of retaliation that I'm going to talk about. So what happens, it happens with relatives, it may happen with friends, it may happen with partners, it happens in all different kinds of contexts. It can happen in the workplace, where we say, you know what, I actually don't like it when you hug me. I would like you to not hug me. Or, you know what, you've already asked me that question 3 times. I've already told you that's something I don't want to talk about. That's too personal. I want you to stop asking me those personal questions. These are just a couple of examples of the kind of boundaries that arise. Or, this is like the fourth time you've told me that I need to see a doctor about this. That's not my choice. I'm not choosing right now to see a doctor about this. I need you to stop telling me that. Because this is often the shape that a boundary violation takes is someone's determination to control some way that we're living or some decision that we're making about what's good for us or what our values are or how we want to live. So we assert the boundary. I don't want you to do that. I don't want to be asked that question anymore. I don't want the nosiness. I don't want the touching, whatever it may be. Really commonly, unfortunately, we're going to get responses that are retaliatory. One of the kinds that we're going to get is that it shouldn't bother you. There's nothing wrong with what I'm doing. And that's often going to take the shape of a sentence that starts with, I'm just, or I was just. I was just trying to help. I'm just trying to show my concern. I was just trying to be kind to you. I was just trying to be affectionate with you. Those are actually retaliatory comments, believe it or not, because they are telling you that you shouldn't be complaining. It would be different if the person actually apologized, said, oh, I didn't realize that bothered you. I won't do it again. And then said, I was just trying to help. That would be really different. But that's not what we usually hear. We usually hear in this annoyed tone, I was just trying to help. And that sends a really different message. That's not the same as apologizing, saying, yes, I'm going to respect the boundary in the future, and then wanting to explain where they were coming from, what their intentions were. That's really different. But how we tend to get it is in this blaming, irritated kind of way. And that tends to mean that boundary violations are not going to stop from that person. Because when the person responds with, well, geez, I'm just trying to be your friend, or I'm just trying to watch out for your health. My experience is that when we get those responses, it doesn't let up. Another response is going to be that you're too sensitive. Well, you're just too sensitive. That shouldn't bother you. It doesn't bother anybody else in my life. I do all those same things to everybody else. Nobody else minds when I put my hand on their arm, or nobody else, minds a little, personal conversation. Two things I'll say about this. First of all, it's totally beside the point what this person's experience is with other people. What difference does that make? You're talking about what your needs are and what your boundaries are. You're under zero obligation to have the same needs or boundaries as other people. But the second point I'll say is it's really probably not true. It's unlikely that this is bothering nobody else. This person is either being dishonest or they're being clueless about how they're affecting other people. So it's unlikely. But again, even if it's true, it doesn't matter. You have the right to do things the way you want to do them. Another form of retaliation is the ways that the person kind of gets back at you later for having asserted the boundary. So it might be days or weeks, it might be a long time later. The person's like, oh, yeah, actually, I just remembered you don't like it when I say that kind of thing. I need to not say that kind of thing. And they're kind of like sarcastic about it. Or, oh, I know I'm not supposed to go there with you. That's just a different way of saying you're crazy, sensitive, and hysterical. They're just acting it out instead of saying it. Those references later where the person's acting like in some way you kind of victimized them by asserting the boundary, those again are retaliatory. I could give a bunch of further examples of retaliation, but I think I've given you enough to cover some of the most common ones and to help you recognize them. Now, you may well have people in your life where you can't stop them from retaliating. And in fact, retaliatory people are quite hard to stop. And if it's someone that you can sort of get away from, you may just need to stop being around them very much. Sometimes in work situations or in certain life situations involving relatives, there's not a lot in the short term that we can do about it. Sometimes we eventually figure out some ways to manage it, but it doesn't mean we're going to be instantly able to fix the problem. But again, it's already helpful just to recognize it. It's already helpful just to have a name for it. So start to notice, oh, that person was getting me back for having asserted a boundary. oh, that little nasty comment was retaliatory. You may not think it right away because you're going to feel defensive and you're going to start probably defending yourself when the person retaliates. That's a natural reaction. But maybe a few minutes later, you'll start to realize, oh, yeah, that was retaliation. And that's helpful. That's helpful in itself. That'll make you feel at least a little better just to have a name for it and to recognize what was happening. And it'll help you continue in the future towards asserting your boundaries more and more successfully because you've had a name to call it when you were retaliated against. That way the retaliation will be less likely, in other words, to stop you from asserting boundaries. It does come up, unfortunately, in our lives where certain people we have to just decide, I can't be around this person. Like, I'm going to have to basically remove this person from my life, at least for some substantial period of time, because I've let them know over and over again that what they're doing is bothering me and that that's a boundary and they simply will not respect it. Sometimes people, we even use the word boundary, like that is a boundary. You need to not go there, and they keep going there anyhow. Then sometimes we have to step away. When it's relatives, sometimes that's a really painful loss. When it's a workplace situation, sometimes it's a real problem because it could be an economic loss to us. That's sometimes more than we can handle, and sometimes people are stuck in workplace situations where they're being terribly treated, and that's not okay. But sometimes, in the short term at least, we don't have easy ways to escape those situations. So, but when you have the choice, that you may have to use it sometimes. I find over the course of life that we just have to make those decisions, from time to time in our lives. Like, this person's too invasive. I'm going to have to just not have them. So there's volumes more to say about boundaries. There's great resources out there. I'll look up a couple of my favorite books and put them in the description under this video. But that gives you at least kind of the thumbnail of what boundaries are all about and some of the role that they play in our lives and some of what goes on inside of us when our boundaries have been repeatedly violated, especially during childhood. So I'm going to talk now about the other part, which is about boundaries in co-counseling. So the co-counseling relationship is, by its very nature, an emotionally intimate relationship. And that means that respect for boundaries becomes extra important. Respect for boundaries is always important. But this isn't like just a simple relationship like you might have with a friend. This is a complicated relationship where we're typically opening up about the issues in our lives that have some pain and vulnerability attached to them. We are often just showing emotions and discharging emotions in front of another person, which adds a layer of vulnerability. We're talking about some of the things that matter the most to us in life. And remember, we're not just vulnerable about our pains, we're also vulnerable about our joys. And sharing our deepest joys also leads to vulnerability. There are ways that someone's thoughtlessness can hurt us, where we've really exposed how much we love certain people or certain things, or how much we care about the world, or how much we care about certain issues. So respecting boundaries is really, really important in co-counseling. So the first boundary, which I mention almost every day when I'm teaching a co-counseling class, once the co-counseling session is over, you do not make any reference to what that person said at any time, including during your own counseling turn. You don't say, oh, so when you were talking about such and such, that reminded me of this issue for me, or, oh yeah, I have some of the same things going on with my dad that you have going on with your mom. That's off limits. You're referring to their session. So that's the first boundary, is once a person's counseling turn is over, there's no reference to anything they said during their turn. The next set of issues that I'm going to talk about are going to get increasingly complex. First of all, completely inappropriate to have any sexual contact before, during, or after a co-counseling session. I'm talking about now sessions in person. And so there's not to be any kind of physical intimacy. That we have to insist upon, because any physical intimacy that happens kind of before or during or after a co-counseling session was automatically done without proper consent, even if it looked consensual, because this is a context of unusual vulnerability. And it's a context where feelings that we're going into can bring up very deep sexual feelings from our past. We may also be dealing with sexual injuries from our past. The context of a co-counseling relationship can make us kind of fall in love with our co-counselor, and because we're seeing each other at our best and we're giving each other all this love and positive attention, that can make it feel like, oh, this, having sex with this person would just be the greatest thing in the world. It's not a context for good decisions. It's a context for people to come out really hurt and for people to come out feeling violated. Now that in turn leads to an even more complex set of issues, which is that I encourage people very strongly to, if the primary way that you have become close to this person is through co-counseling with them or being in co-counseling classes with them or co-counseling retreats with them, that you not form a friendship with them, and that you certainly not become lovers with them. And I'm going to say a few things about why I recommend this so strongly. And the first thing I'll say is a very practical one, which is I've been co-counseling for decades and I have not seen it go to good places. I can't say I never have, but I've rarely seen it go to good places. When people develop a friendship with someone where the way they primarily came to know them was through co-counseling, or when they get involved with people where that's the primary way that they got connected, the vast majority of the time, those relationships blow up, and they blow up fast. And so that's a very unpleasant and sad experience to have those relationships go south. You've lost the co-counseling relationship with someone who could have been a great and close co-counselor for you. When you try to add a friendship or try to add a romantic relationship to a co-counseling relationship, it's not that you end up with both. You're usually going to end up with neither. The friendship isn't going to work, or the dating thing isn't going to work, and in the process, you're going to lose your co-counseling relationship. Why? Because you end up with bad feelings about what happened when you attempted to be friends or lovers, or some intense disappointment, but also often some bad feelings, some resentments about things. That's what tends to happen when friendships and partnerships blow up. And so then it doesn't feel safe anymore as a co-counseling relationship. That's a big loss. Also, co-counselors tend to be part of a network. If you're part of the Peak Living Network, you're connected to the wider Peak Living Network in a global sense, in a national and international sense. But also people tend to start to form networks where they live with other people who do co-counseling. So if two people suddenly, who are part of that network, are suddenly on terrible terms, they suddenly can't stand each other because their friendship or their partnership blew up, that doesn't just affect them. That affects other people in their network. Oh, suddenly we can't have Jane and Shirley at the same gathering because they hate each other now because they got involved for a while, and now that blew up. So it affects the people around you. It has these widespread ramifications. Of course, any friendship can blow up. Any relationship between lovers can blow up, but it just happens so much more commonly, in my experience, close to 100% of the time, when people's relationships grow out of co-counseling relationships, but it's very, very short-lived. The co-counseling relationship doesn't build the way a friendship normally builds, or even the way a dating relationship normally builds. We're skipping a bunch of steps that you play out in the development of a social relationship. We're going much more quickly, typically, to emotional intimacy without having laid a groundwork of so how do we communicate? How do we do things? What do we like to eat? How do we negotiate decision making? How do we communicate? I mean, all these kinds of things we're never discovering about each other, because it's like you have your turn for the 50 minutes and then I have my turn for 50 minutes or for 5 minutes or whatever it is. It's like we're following a very set structure that doesn't challenge us. That's part of why we have that very set structure, so that we don't have to deal with all those challenges that social relationships have, and we can just go straight to doing our healing work. but it means we're not building the structure for a social relationship. So one of the things that happens when people start to socialize is that they tend very quickly to realize, oh, we really irritate each other, or we really have very different ways of making decisions, or we actually have even some significantly different values about things, or one of us is attracted in a romantic sense and the other one is not. And so now we're dealing with that whole imbalance, which is always awkward, and there's all kinds of difficulties. Even the best friendships and the best romantic partnerships have ups and downs. You have times when you're irritated with each other. You have times when things aren't going well. You have times when there's some resentments that have built up and you haven't had a chance to process them yet. Part of what's so wonderful about a co-counseling relationship that's just a co-counseling relationship is that those kinds of dynamics get very little chance to arise. So your co-counselor, a close co-counselor, is someone that you can pretty much count on 100% of the time. Like, I can call this person for a mini session on the phone or for a full session, whether it's going to be online or in person. And if that person's got the time, we can do it any time. It's never like, oh, this is going to be a bad time for us because we're not getting along right now. And it's so helpful to our healing and helpful in other ways in life to have some relationships that don't have the vicissitudes that social relationships have, that are unusually stable, that are unusually clear and clean. So this is a whole other reason not to form social relationships, is that the co-counseling relationship is a special form of stability that plays a really special role in our lives. That's really nice to have. It's a special thing. And we're freer in the co-counseling relationship if we know we're not going to have to deal with this person in other contexts. We're freer to work on certain things that we may feel ashamed about or that are very deep. Issues where we don't necessarily want a person in our lives who knows all that stuff about us. Or if I'm going to go to certain places of like screaming in fear or like crying my guts out like a baby, maybe I don't want to see this person 3 days from now and know that they just saw me in that kind of place. So value and treasure your co-counseling relationship. And then the last point I'm going to make about the discouragement of moving towards social relationship is we try to use a co-counseling relationship to heal, to do the emotional work we're trying to do and the emotional discharge that we're trying to do. And another way to think about what we're doing is we're trying to use that relationship to address the issues we need to address in our lives and make the changes we need to make in our lives. And one of the challenges that almost all of us have in the modern world is how to have enough close relationships. How am I going to find closer friends and build those friendships? If I'm single, how am I going to find a lover and build a really good partnership? If we're using co-counseling as a source of friends or lovers, we're using it to not do the work. Instead of using it to solve problems, we're using it to avoid solving those problems. If I'm running into barriers to building the friendships that I need to work through what those challenges are, not use co-counseling as a way to duck those challenges and not have to do that work. So the habit that I recommend people to be really strongly in is keep your co-counseling relationships. Now, by the way, because of the kind of foundation that a friendship or a romantic partnership has, it tends to work quite well to add a co-counseling relationship to a friendship or a partnership that's already solid and strong. It's the other direction that it doesn't work. It doesn't work well to add a friendship or a partnership to a co-counseling relationship. But don't hesitate to co-counsel with your friends and lovers. That can often work really, really well. There's some guidelines that are in the manual about how to do that. But yeah, don't hesitate to do that. However, even then, I recommend that you have one or two co-counselors in your life that aren't part of your life for all the reasons that I just discussed about what's so valuable about a co-counseling relationship that's just a co-counseling relationship. If you feel that your boundaries have been violated at any point by a co-counselor, please don't sit quietly with that. It's really important to talk to other people from the Peak Living Network or talk to other people in your life about it. Don't keep it a secret. Get support and help about it and decide how you want to address it. And you may feel that you can adequately address it with the person directly, and then you'll see if you get a response that feels satisfactory to you, and see if you get a response that gives you a sense of confidence that that boundary violation is not going to be repeated. Then that's fine. But even then, like I'm saying, don't have it be just between you and that person. Even if you're addressing it with that person and you get a response that feels good enough to you, make sure that there's still somebody besides the two of you who knows that went on. If you're not comfortable raising it directly with the person, or if you do raise it directly with the person and you don't find their response satisfactory, or if the violation was at a level where you think this is really unsafe and could be an emotional risk to other people in the network, then it's really important to raise it, talk to people that you know in the network, including maybe people who are teachers or who are in positions of leadership within the network, and make decisions together about how this is going to be responded to. It's very important to us in the Peak Living Network to create a sense of safety and to create a network where boundary violations are not tolerated. What happens when someone who's really invasive comes into an organization, they start to get a read, and I'm not saying this is necessarily conscious in them, but on some level, this person who's got a violating style starts to get a read on whether this is an atmosphere where I'm going to be able to get away with it, or is this an atmosphere where I'm going to get shut down pretty fast if I behave in these ways. And organizations that excuse those kinds of behaviors and keep a lot of secrecy about them and don't address them forcefully when they arise, then other boundary violators start to discover that this is a receptive atmosphere for boundary violators, and you start to have rampant problems in your organization. So the solution is to have is to not keep secrets, to have a clear process from the very beginning about how we're going to address boundary violations that happen, and where we absolutely have to be satisfied that these kinds of violations are not going to be repeated, or we can't have this person be part of the network. And we're always going to be willing to look carefully into concerns that are raised. We're going to make sure that they're addressed. We're going to do everything that we can. Obviously, there are things that are beyond our power, but we're going to do everything we can to make sure that people's boundaries are respected. That contributes to the healing potential for all of us. Because if we're in a network where we know boundaries here are going to be respected, are not going to be violated, that creates a context for all of us to be able to do deeper healing work, to be able to trust each other, to be able to expose vulnerable aspects of ourselves that we need to be able to expose if we're going to be able to do significant healing work. So you can find a longer discussion about boundaries in co-counseling in the manual, in the Healing Partnership. And as I said, there are all kinds of resources out there about boundaries in general, and learning how to identify what boundaries you need, and strategies for becoming more successful and effective at asserting those boundaries in our lives.